community, this is Tommy in North Carolina, and I'm going to do a video response to a video that Beatle James has done. Beatle James is James Griffiths, the Vinyl Professor. He has a second channel where he recently did a video discussing the Beatles' White Album. And so I know Jeff Party did a response, and I'm going to do one as well where I'm going to talk about the White Album and my thoughts. And James sort of was taking the angle of whether or not the White Album should be a single or double, which is an ongoing debate and has been for a number of years with Beatles fans. And I did sort of, I think, a while back, one of my earlier videos, I did a response to Canadian Stud Muffin posed the question concerning the White Album. And I think I stated there that I feel like the White Album is great as a double disc, and I'll take it for what it is. And, you know, as I talk about it a little bit, I will discuss maybe some of the issues that I have with it or problems. But on its own, I think it's fine, and it's a great album. It definitely is sort of the beginning of the end, and so that part of it makes it a bit harder to take, knowing that this is sort of where the unraveling starts to happen. Yoko becomes more ever present in the studio. Paul takes more control of the band and the musical direction. But also I find it interesting that there's a lot of the formula that the Beatles had established, and it was true on the White Album as well, especially concerning like George Harrison only got 2 songs per album, 1 Ringo track. I find that interesting that formula was still there because of I guess the Lennon-McCartney ego. And when you think of songs that were passed over, like I'm going to go with Not Guilty. When I heard Not Guilty on the anthology as a completed song, I thought, why would they pass this over, especially in favor of stuff like Wild Honey Pie, which, you know, those tracks are throwaways. But I'll go through it song by song. Let me just discuss for a second my sort of history with the White Album. When I was discovering the Beatles and really getting into that later period Beatles, I've told you guys before, the Blue Album was kind of my jumping point. So I didn't have any of the history of Abbey Road or Sgt. Pepper or Revolver or any of those sort of established things that were told over and over and over about the Beatles. I just was enjoying the music and the songs for what they were. Like I said, I kind of got into the Beatles through compilations. My dad had the Hey Jude album, and then, like I said, later I was discovering things like Hey Jude, and then the Blue Album, the 67 through 70. And those are all compilations, but when I was a young guy and didn't know any better, they were just the songs are what I was sort of absorbing. And the White Album was no exception. I was buying cassettes, and I remember, you know, the Blue Album was kind of my jumping off point, and then I think I quickly turned around and bought on cassette the Beatles, and I didn't know that was the White Album. If you remember, the Beatles cassette had the black and white photos on the cover of the cassette of the inserts that came with the White Album. I did not know that was the White Album. So I listened to it, and I knew it had songs like Helter Skelter and songs like that. And so I listened to it as a collection of songs and thought, this is a kind of an odd collection. The Beatles are weird. Happiness is a Worm Gun. Everybody's got something to hide. So they were all these sort of songs that that I had no real sort of context for what it was. I just was taking it for you know, taking it as it is. And then I remember as I got older and discovered, well, that's the White Album, and I knew what it was. I you know, was able to sort of recognize it and take it as the White Album proper. And I bought it on CD for the first time when I was in college. And just as a side note, as a story, I remember I went to a small college in Mississippi, in a very small town in the Mississippi Delta, Delta State University. And there was only one store in town that sold CDs. And I bought, I had to specially order the White Album, and it came in, and I went and got it. And I remember me and my bandmate, Danny, who, the theme song here for my video, Radioactive, we've been together for a long time. But Danny and I went and bought it. It was at a little store right off campus, and it was during our lunch break, and I remember going back to my dorm room, and we put on the White Album and was listening to it. And I remember getting about halfway through disc 1, and Danny just kind of went, Lennon and McCartney make it really difficult to write original songs. And that was a very sort of profound statement because, I understood exactly what he meant. And just listening to Lennon and McCartney as songwriters, it's easy to understand why the Beatles were such a big deal. So we're going to fast forward now to me sort of collecting everything on vinyl, and that's what I'm going to focus on, is the White Album on vinyl. And so a few years ago, I got the mono reissue of the White Album. This was the one that came out in 2014. It's the White Album in mono. Now, I read things like the Steve Hoffman forums, and from everything I had read concerning the White Album, is that for some reason it was a very lousy pressed record. It didn't have a good quality. So I kind of avoided buying any White Albums because A, they were expensive, B, usually not in very good shape, and C, they weren't quality pressings. So I avoided it. I enjoyed this mono. This was the only vinyl copy that I had for a long time, and it faithfully reproduces the originals. They are on Apple labels per the original, and they have all the inserts and everything that came with it. I'm not going to pull it out because it's in there pretty good, but it's a top loader. And it's a good quality pressing. Now this is kind of a twofold thing because this is actually a recent acquisition that I found in the last few weeks, and I haven't shown it yet, so I'm going to show it today. But I recently picked up this copy of the White Album. Now, as you can tell, this is a later pressing, obviously from the 70s. But the reason I got it was it's on the white vinyl. As you can tell, it's a white vinyl, purple Capitol label from the late 70s. This is mastered by Capitol, and it is, it's not a Wally, it is, let me double check this here, it is ERT. So it's a good clean. The jacket's in good shape. The vinyl's in great shape. It had all of the inserts with it, the poster as well as the 4 photos, which I'll pull out here. And so I've always heard that the 70s British White Album with the Union Jack flag, white vinyl, was probably the best quality pressing, stereo pressing of the White Album, which I can't afford it and can't find it. But this was in a local record store of mine, and so I was able to pick it up at a decent price, and especially in the shape it's in. I listened to it and am quite happy with it. But the 4 photos, there's John, and this kind of goes into my whole sort of fascination with the White Album, Paul McCartney. And you've seen these photos a million times. George Harrison and Ringo Starr. And one of the things I've always liked about the White Album, maybe it was having it on cassette, having those 4 pictures, but this is sort of my favorite period of the Beatles, the 68 period, pre-bearded John Lennon. Lennon had the long hair. They lost the pepper mustaches of 67, and they just looked really cool to me. Paul looking really cool, got a little stubble, so he's starting to grow the beard, but looking good. George, he kept the mustache, but like I said, the hairstyle looks good. Ringo, yeah. So that's sort of my favorite look for the Beatles. And so having discussed that, I mean, yeah, the cover, this plain white cover, which is iconic now. But going through the tracks and talking about them, which I'll take a minute here to do, that's the other thing. Like, for a long time, and it probably was cheating, but I always considered the White Album to be sort of a desert island Beatles disc to me, and it was always a cheat because you got twice as much music. But to me, one of the things that draws me into the White Album is that it is varied. Now, I know that the critique that James had, as well as Jeff, I think, were discussing that they really weren't a complete band at this point, that Ringo had left at some point during the sessions and came back. All of that stuff has been documented, but song for song, I really enjoy the White Album, and so I'm going to go through it really quickly with you. Side 1, record 1, opens with Back in the USSR. Beach Boys like rocker, and I think Jeff pointed out that he didn't even realize that Ringo wasn't even the drummer on that track, which is interesting. But I like Back in the USSR. I especially love the guitar solo part coming in that last verse where it just screams out. But then it gives way to Dear Prudence, which is just a lovely John Lennon ballad. I like the way the bass kind of rolls through it and the background vocals. Glass Onion, which is just a weird, wacky song, lyrically dropping clues to other Beatles songs like Fool on the Hill, I'm the Walrus, Strawberry Fields. Obla Di Obla Da, Life Goes On, even with the mistake in the final verse from Paul. I love the song. And then you get to Wild Honey Pie. That's a filler track. It's a throwaway. The thing is, it's short enough that it doesn't overstay its welcome, so it's fine for what it is. But I can definitely see, in hearing some of the outtakes, like Not Guilty, yeah, I probably could have passed over Wild Honey Pie for a Not Guilty, which is, to me, a much better song. Then you get to the continuing story of Bungalow Bill, which is a John Lennon song with some strange Alice in Wonderland type lyrics. About elephant hunting, but the thing about Bungalow Bill, like, to me, it always in my mind sounded like a children's song almost, and that you could almost make an animated show about Bungalow Bill. Maybe it's just the title. And then we get to a song that James kind of pointed out, and I might even be inclined to agree. While My Guitar Gently Weeps, I've appreciated that song more as the years have gone on, but it never was one of my favorites when I was first sort of enjoying the White Album. And so, having said that, when I did hear the anthology stripped down acoustic demo version, which was later orchestrated for the Love album, that song really began to speak to me the melody and everything. I never was a big fan of While My Guitar Gently Weeps, and I know that's probably a bit of heresy on the part of a Beatles fan, because it's a beloved song. But to me, I mean, I don't hate it, don't get me wrong, it's not like something that I could do without, but it's just not one of my favorite tracks. I like and Happiness is a Warm Gun. I think, again, it's a strange tune, but I love John's vocal on it, and particularly, the outro. And then, later told that it was a drug song, but I don't know. So we move on to side 2. I think James mentioned how he's a big fan of Martha, My Dear. I think that is Paul McCartney at his very best. A great melody. I do love it when the song kind of kicks in with the driving beat. I'm So Tired, which I believe Jeff pointed out was a favorite. I'm a big fan of that song too. Blackbird is, Paul McCartney acoustic ballad, beautiful song, beautiful guitar part. It just, it works on every level. Piggies is another George Harrison track, which musically is kind of ambitious with the harpsichord and just the overall feel of the song, but it's a social comment, so quite interesting. And then you get Rocky Raccoon, which I think James was talking about how he doesn't like Rocky Raccoon. Rocky Raccoon was probably one of the tracks that drew me into the White Album. When I heard it on the radio the first time, I thought, this is it's a little folksy tune, but I love the Gideon's Bible line and everything. I just love the way it tied into that. And my uncle Cheryl played that song quite a bit, that and Dear Prudence, and so I have a soft spot for Rocky Raccoon. I definitely wouldn't cut it. Don't Pass Me By, which is a Ringo Starr original, and apparently it goes back to the early days of the Beatles, because I remember hearing an interview disc where they talk about that song, Don't Pass Me By, and I think John even quotes, Don't Pass Me By, Don't Make Me Cry, Don't Make Me Blue. I think the question was concerning whether or not Ringo composes, and that song came up. So that song had been around for quite a few years when it finally got around to being on the White Album. Why Don't We Do It in the Road is another filler track. When you talk about cutting songs from the White Album, that certainly might be one to go, along with Wild Honey Pie. Those would be my top two. If I was going to cut songs, that would be where I'd go. I Will is just a sweet McCartney ballad, and then it ends with Julia, which is a heartwarming song that John wrote, named after his mother, his deceased mother, and it's a beautiful song. And John is very tender in delivery of that. So then we move on to the second disc. It kicks off with Birthday. Simple song, not much to it, but it's a rocker, and it has a fun beat. Followed by Your Blues, which is John Lennon doing a sort of nasty, almost Dylan impression with with lyrics like "The Wormy Licks My Bone" and stuff like that. And of course, he even does mention Bob Dylan in it with Dylan's "Mr. Jones" from Ballad of a Thin Man. Just a straight up blues track. Mother Nature's Son, another McCartney acoustic ballad. Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except for Me and My Monkey. Aside from the long, interesting title, I've always dug that song, and I especially love Ringo's ride cymbal, ding, 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 kind of beat to it. Lyrically, there's probably not much to it. Sexy Sadie, I think, was a sort of a comment on their dealings with the Maharishi. As a matter of fact, I'd always read in different places that you replace Sexy Sadie with Maharishi, and that became John's sort of response to that. And everybody knows Helter Skelter. Now this is where the album kind of takes a left turn, and maybe when I was a kid and knowing or learning about Charles Manson and that whole thing, and there was a movie, and not really tying it into the Beatles, this is where I will admit that the second disc of the White Album, and particularly as it goes on, it gets creepy for me. And I think it starts with Helter Skelter. Just knowing the history of the song. Now, I know the song itself has nothing to do with murdering people or anything like that. That it's a slide or a roller coaster ride, but it's creepy in the way Ringo screams. I've got blisters on my fingers. It's a creepy sounding track. Despite the fact that it's heavy and it rocks, but then it goes into a long, long, long. Which I agree with Jeff on this. That I think "Long, Long, Long" is a very underrated George Harrison song. I think that guitar line is just very moving. It's beautiful, and I really do appreciate musically. I appreciate "Long, Long, Long," even though it ends with that one note and the chord sort of creaking. It's creepy. The album gets very scary for me. Like, it's not an album that I'd want to listen to in the dark late at night, and particularly the second disc. And so then you flip the record over, and it starts with Revolution #1, which is the acoustic version of Revolution. It goes into Honey Pie. Now, Honey Pie is When I'm 64 version 2. I probably like Honey Pie a little better, but it's McCartney doing the schmaltzy kind of sound. Savoy Truffle, another George Harrison song, good beat. It kind of brings the album back a little bit out of the creep factor. But then you get into Cry Baby Cry, which again is sort of a Lewis Carroll kind of, whimsical kind of tale about the king and queen. And it's again, it comes back to being a little creepy. I don't know why, but it has kind of a frightening little factor to it. And then, of course, Cry Baby Cry segues into Revolution 9, which is probably the most controversial track on the album because it's a collection of tape noises and sound effects and just looped together by John Lennon. It's very difficult to call it music, but I do find Revolution 9 sort of an interesting piece of abstract art. And it's a longer track, but to me, if it were probably 5 minutes longer, it would be too much. So for what it is and where it sits on the album, it's okay. But I do understand the criticism of it, and I do understand that it's hard to call it music because it's not musical composition in the truest form. But when you get into things like John Cage and sort of abstract music of the time, it definitely fits in. And then, of course, the album ends with the tender ballad "Good Night," which is a lullaby that John Lennon wrote, actually, but Ringo sings it, fittingly enough. And so that's the White Album. That's the tracks for the White Album. So really, just going through them track by track, there's probably only 3 things maybe I would cut. Wild Honey Pie, Why Don't We Do It in the Road, and maybe Revolution 9, just for what it is. But I kind of go with that smart aleck McCartney response from the anthology where he goes, it's the White Album, accept it. I do. And so I like the White Album fine enough, and I would rank it in probably my top half of Beatles albums. I do find that I play it and listen to it and enjoy it each time I do, so it's not one of those it's a labor to put on. Now, where it fits alongside albums like Rubber Soul and Revolver, I don't know. I would rank it ahead of Abbey Road. Go back and watch my video on Abbey Road, as just in terms of just for me to listen to and enjoy. I think the White Album does its job, and it certainly is fitting in the Beatles catalog. But so there's my thoughts on the White Album. That's where I am with it. And I definitely recommend that you go check out Beatle James and his original video on it. And he's got some interesting insight to talk about what happens there. But I give the White Album a solid thumbs up. And there's my 2 vinyl copies of the White Album. I have a stereo and a mono, and my white vinyl pressing, which I was really, really happy to get. So the White Album, there you have it. I forgot to mention, like, subscribe, comment, share, follow me on Instagram and Twitter. It's TommyBurton75. I usually show what I'm spinning on there, so please do that. And thanks for watching, guys. I appreciate it.